So I'm going to tell you the story about a Toledo Steam Car. I'm going to depend upon three primary sources. One is the book written by Sherry and Richard Magnum, and Sherry Magnum is here with us today. So she can, as I tell you lies that I've made up, she'll correct them for you. In addition, in the Los Angeles Sunday Herald, which was a precursor of the LA Times, there was a detailed article about what this trip was in 1902. So article, and also the Coconino Sun, which was a precursor of the Daily Sun, also wrote up a couple of articles on this trip. So those are the primary source documents that I'm going to be using. Let me know if I'm not speaking loud enough for those in the back of the room. So this is a story. It's two parts. One is a Toledo Steam Car that took off in 1902, took off in January of 1902 to go from Flagstaff to the Grand Canyon. So somebody gave a lot of thought to this, but not enough. And then in 2014, this exact same car came back to Flagstaff and took the trip again. So I'm going to tell you the two tales of the steam car. You're going to have to give me the clicker. So I'm going to set the stage just a little bit and tell you a little bit about the Grand Canyon. Back in the 1900s, the El Tovar Hotel had not been built until 1905. And as you can see, even in 1905, they were using horse and buggy to tour people around the Grand Canyon. Back in 1902, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to look at my slides at the same time. So there was the Grandview Hotel was built by Pete Berry. That's the primary place where tourists were observing the Grand Canyon, was out at Grandview Point, where Pete Berry's hotel was. But the railroad came in 1901 to the Grand Canyon Village, where the village is, and then the El Tovar was built in 1905. So as a result, all of that traffic that was coming up the stagecoach route from Flagstaff to the Grand Canyon now was coming from where? Williams to the Grand Canyon by virtue of the train. So we start out in January of 1902, an excellent time to take dirt stagecoach roads up to the Grand Canyon. The trip was called the trip from hell, and it truly was a trip from hell. In 1901, Oliver Lippencock arrives from Los Angeles. He's a photographer. He comes to Flagstaff as a business opportunity. What the thought is let's take this automobile and drive it on these stagecoach routes and prove how good an automobile is for transportation, because an automobile was not primary transportation in this day and age. He had the backing of the American Bicycle Company. Get that, American Bicycle Company. And you'll see this when you see the car of the Toledo steam-driven car automobile. The ABA were this as a promotional opportunity. So that's why they were sponsoring this. He was also accompanied by Hogan Boom. I guess that's how you pronounce his name, Hogan Boom. He was a journalist for the LA Times, or what eventually became the LA Times. And he wrote this article and titled the article, "The Trip from Hell." I'm going to explain to you a little bit about a steam car. I couldn't find a steam car, so we're going to look at at a railroad car. What happens is they have coal. In this case, they had gasoline. The gasoline would heat up the water, creating steam. Steam would then drive this piston, which would drive the crankshaft and the wheels. So that's how a steam car works, okay? And we're going to go into that a little bit more as we go further. the trip from, I'm sorry, trip from hell, the car, Lippincott came with specific claims to the Flagstaff community. He was bragging like heck that this car was going to be the be all end all. He said it's a 10 horsepower, high speed marine engines. It had storage capacity for 50 gallons of oil or gasoline and 57 gallons of water. It was speed tested in Toledo to Detroit, going 42 miles an hour. I'm not sure any of these claims are real, by the way, but these are the claims that he was. The tires were 4 inches wide, solid rubber. It weighed 2,200 pounds, where mud, snow, or ice could not seriously impede its progress at all. It was equipped with a cyclometer, which recorded the distance traveled. It accommodates 3 in the front and 3 in the trailer, plus the trailer, quote, could carry 1,000 pounds of baggage and also water and gasoline for the boiler. So let's take a look at this car a little bit. This car is unique, and this uniqueness is why we know it is exactly the same car in 2014 as it was in 1901. So in 1901, the Automobile, which was a magazine of the day, told of a Toledo Steam Car built for Oliver Lippincott. It was unique. It had a bigger water tank. It had a 6-inch longer wheelbase. It had the addition of extra chassis tubes. That's these tubes, these diagonal tubes right here for the car. And then a trailer was added to carry water and fuel. And we're going to come back to this when we take a look at the 2014 version. We're going to see these exact same changes to this car. The people that were involved in this trip were Oliver Lippincott. There was a Chapman, who was also a newspaper man, Hogenboom, which was the main newspaper man that wrote this Trip from Hell article. And there was also Al Doyle. Al Doyle at the time is quoted as being, he's an old timer in these parts, a plainsman, a mountain, typical Westerner. He lived in Flagstaff. He was well known in Flagstaff. Doyle Mountain is named after him. This was his house back in 1911, and it has since burned down. They originally contacted Doyle to get directions from Flagstaff to the Grand Canyon. And so Doyle started telling them all about the directions. And see if you can follow these directions with me. So after you get right over the rise, just outside of town, you strike down Fort Valley, you bear off to the west so as not to get too far. By the time he got through with all these instructions, Lippincott said, "Why don't you come with us?" So Doyle did. Doyle joined them. Hogenbaum described the people of Flagstaff. And I think this is exactly the description today of Flagstaff. Back in 1902, he said, "They are willing to help, of course. The people of Flagstaff are peculiar in that way. They will help anybody or anything. There is something in the atmosphere there, just the right altitude or something that makes Flagstaff people kindly." And I don't know about you guys, but that's kind of the reason I live in Flagstaff. Did you, oh, okay, there we are. So let's take a look at the first day of this trip in January of, I'm sorry to emphasize January, but it's just January of 1902. The trip started at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The guy said, Lippincott said, "I'll be up in the canyon in 3.5 hours." It takes an hour. What does it take to get to the canyon today? An hour and a half, and we have paved roads and everything. He'll be up there in 3.5 hours. Flagstaff turned out mass. This was a big deal. This was an event. So the Flagstaff turned out in mass. The car worked splendidly for about 10 miles. Just as they got outside of town, the trailer was bearing down on the hind axle. So if you take a look at this thing, here's remember, ABC, American Bicycle Company. Those are bicycle tires. Those are probably the same tires I have on my bicycle today. And they start out with 4 people, 2 in front and 2 in the trailer, and then a whole bunch of luggage and gasoline and water in the back. And they find that the trailer is binding down on the back axle of this and preventing it from moving. Do is they unload all of the luggage, dump all the people, they unbind the back axle, and by this time it is dark. They're now trying to travel in the dark, and what Hogan Boom says is they experience fantastic forms appear around us, forms of bears, tigers, elephants, and alligators. I mean, this is kind of a frightful little adventure that they're on. So on day 1, they had anticipated being in the Grand Canyon that night. They had packed no provisions for the trip, although they did have matches and tobacco, so they were okay, right? Doyle knew of a cabin, Moody Span's cabin. So he took them to the cabin, and they found 3 cowboys there who had recently killed a steer. So these 4 made no provisions for the night, had nice juicy steaks and biscuits and coffee that night. It's pretty surprising. Now we're on day 2. Day 1 wasn't very successful. Day 2, they wake up. It's January. I'm sorry to keep emphasizing that. Now the water is all frozen. They're using a ton of gas to unfreeze the water. But no worry, they'll be in the canyon later than 2 p.m. For 10 miles, they scooted down the forest like sliding down the chutes. But then the water gauge bursts. It forced the use of gas purchased in Flagstaff. They came down about 3 miles an hour because this gasoline was not good gasoline. They decided to abandon the trailer, all the luggage, and all 4 people piled in front, which I find impossible because I sat in this car and 2 people kept in front, much less 4. Soon the sprocket chain broke. So imagine a bicycle, it's just like a chain on a bicycle, and that broke. And it took them ages to fix that. It was now midnight of day 2. Remember, they have no provisions. They didn't expect to be out. And now they're bedded down with no food to shiver through the night. But they had little water and hardly any usable gas. They only went 2 miles and they had to abandon the car. Now they've given up the car and they started walking. And they reached a sign, and which set forth that it was 6 3/8 miles to the canyon. That doesn't sound like too far. After a short time, it was only Hogan Boom that was able to continue on. About 4 p.m. and more than 18 miles later, Hogan Boom reached Barry's Grandview Hotel and was asked what he wanted. All I want is water and food and the address and the sign. Barry sent out a rescue, picked up the rest of the people, brought them back to the hotel, sent out some horses, and started the car up to Grandview Hotel. The next day, they called for gas, not to the Grandview Hotel, but they called for gas the following day. It was now Thursday, 6 days after they started, and its own power get to the Grand Canyon. And this is a picture of Al Doyle. Actually, at Grandview, right now, there's a wall, a retaining wall that sits right here. This is Al Doyle in the car without the trailer. And several days later, Lippincott left the Grand Canyon. Only 7 hours later, and 67 miles, he got back to Flagstaff unencumbered. So he had no problems getting back to Flagstaff with the car. And now we're going to fast forward to 2004. In an auction warehouse, there sits a steam car. this steam car. Nobody knows how it got to the auction warehouse. I don't have any history on the car prior to it arriving in the auction warehouse, but two Brits came and purchased the car. Nick Howell of the United States purchased the steam car, and this car, he didn't realize it at the time. It was different. It had a bigger water tank than the steam car that was built by the American Bicycle Company. It had a 6-inch longer wheelbase, and again, it had these additional diagonal extra chassis tubes. I did not realize that they had the car that traveled from Flagstaff to the Grand Canyon at the time. They just knew that they had the rest of it. And it is in pretty good shape. It's not too shabby. They ended up restoring the car. They, did some body work to it. Most of the body was in good shape. The motor was absolutely destroyed, but most and this is Nick talking about his restoration efforts. The car was very original and complete. Only 3 pieces of wood needed to be replaced. It was completely, and it took him 8 years of on and off restoration to put the car back together. He was invited to attend the Concours d'Elegance in Pebble Beach. And they actually went. That was the reason they came over to the United States to go to the Concours d'Elegance. And they ended up winning, this is them at Pebble Beach, and they ended up winning the trophy. And this is Jay Leno presenting them with the chairman's trophy. They were very excited to have this chairman's trophy. They used to have, because they used to could use the brake. So they thought that was pretty cool. So that was their old parking brake, new parking brake. Interestingly enough, while they were in the UK, having been invited to the Leno pretty well. And why don't you give Jay Leno a call? So Nick Howell bought the car, sent an email to Jay Leno. 2 hours later, Jay Leno responded and used my garage. If you're not familiar with Jay Leno, he has a huge collection of cars and a huge collection of motorcycles, and he has this gigantic garage. So that was kind of a neat thing for Jay Leno to invite them. Jay said, give me a contact, give me a call when you get in, and we'll get together. Well, they did. And then just about an hour later, they get a ring from the downstairs from the hotel saying there's a Jay Leno here. Jay Leno, they went down, Jay Leno was there. And he said, I'd like you guys to take a ride in my 1910 white steam car. That's what this is right here. I thought you guys would like a ride, would like to take a spin. So they actually met Jay Leno. They used his garage to work on their car. They actually had some problems with customs getting the car from the UK back into the United States. The mechanic, Jay Leno's mechanic, happened to help out with it. So Leno was a great help with their adventure of coming back to the States. And I'm lost again. Sorry. So now let's fast forward to 2014. So we were in 1901, 1902. That trip took place. They found the car. They restored it for 8 years. They're now in Pebble Beach. They realize the car is the original car that went from Flagstaff to the Grand Canyon. So they say, let's recreate that trip. So they got a hold of a whole bunch of people in Flagstaff, eventually got a hold of the Grand Canyon Historical Society. got a hold of Tom Martin, who many of you are probably familiar with, and got a hold of me. And so I stole all the information from Sherry's book on where the stagecoach line went. And so I was their cartographer, helping them map out how they would recreate this trip. So there's two Brits. There's Nick. He was the one that restored the car predominantly. And there's Chris. And these two guys are just absolute characters. They are so much fun. They had so much trouble recreating this, but they just had a blast doing it. So then on this trip, here's Tom Martin, who did the primary organization of it. Here's Arnold Schmidt, who was the chief mechanic with Jay Leno. He came, Jay Leno asked him to come over to Flagstaff to help out with this. Here's Alan Travis, who is a car enthusiast and had a Dirac that he brought along. And there's Amy Wong. She was a photographer for the Arizona Republic. Nancy Green, who just recently passed, she was our food organizer and actually the most important person of the entire trip because she prepared the tea. And I've got to tell you, these Brits had to have their tea. So she did all of that for us. And here they're arriving in Flagstaff. They're at the courtyard. We could not believe the interest that people had in this car. But here they are in the courtyard, and they're unloading their car and talking all about the car. There's a Dirac from Alan. Here's Nick explaining the car and how it works. And here we are in Flagstaff. We decided to take a tour around Flagstaff. And fortunately, Richard and Sherry Magnan were able to join us for that. So here's, and notice, I know that Sherry has this awesome smile all the time, but just take a look at that smile. She's just having a blast. And I'm gonna have you, we're gonna show you the car just touring around town a little bit. Go ahead and play it just a little bit. Notice the exhaust that's coming out about that a bit later. There's a track that was there as well. Interestingly enough, so now Richard is in the car with Nick, and they're driving around town, and Nick asks, where did Al Doyle live? And so Richard takes him to the parking lot that was where Al Doyle's home was. And a man came onto the parking lot and said, I have a check. And he showed him a check dated September 1920, and it was from Zane Gray to Al Doyle for $50. And Richard turned over the check, and there was Al Doyle's signature on the back. It was just kind of serendipitous that, and I don't even know who this man was, because by the time they told me the story, I went back and couldn't find this guy. So I don't even know where this came from, but we actually had a check from Al Doyle, and he was the guy to this whole thing for us too. Of course, the train replaced the horses, and the car replaced the train. So we just thought it would be fun to put these guys all together. So go ahead and play it a little bit. And now they're seeing the train come and say hi to them. It was just kind of fun. So now we're on day one of this 2014 adventure, right? This recreation of this adventure. So at 7:30, we take the trailer out Highway 180 to Forest Road 151. There's really two stagecoach routes back in the day. One was the west route, and that's the one that we're taking, and 180 follows a lot of that west route until it turns into 151. And then 151 sort of takes off and becomes a stagecoach route and the Grandview Trail. So we're out at Forest Road 151. They unload the trailer. It takes them about an hour to heat up all the water and get it going to producing some steam so they can take off. And sure enough, we take off to the cheers of the small crowd, sort of like Flagstaff back in the day. And just like back in the day, just as we get outside, everybody's cheering us on and everything is going fine. And we turn the corner and the steam valve sticks. So we're just blowing out steam like this, just blowing out steam. The car's not going anywhere, not going anywhere. But fortunately, this was out of sight of everybody. And then even when we do get up steam, we have trouble going up the inclines. We're not getting enough power to the car. And I'll explain that in more detail later, but I want you to notice all the time as you're looking at this car, how much steam is coming out of the car. The steam should not be coming out of the car. The steam should be pushing that piston, and it's not. And so therefore we're losing power. We're not getting up the incline. So Chris has to get out and push Nick up the inclines. And then of course, once he gets up the incline, he has to run and catch up with the car and hop in the car until the next incline, and then he has to come out and push again. So we're having a little bit of a problem on this trip, just like they were having problems before. And then we get a flat tire. So sure enough, look at this, this is a bicycle tire. You know, that's what it is, American Bicycle Company, it's a bicycle tire. And they're changing the tire just like you change a bicycle tire. And this is about 9 miles out, we have a flat tire. So today, we're having some challenges. But of course, being Brits, we have to have a spot of tea and we have to have lunch. So that's what we're doing here. And then we take off again. And we take off beautifully. But again, look at all this steam that's going out, all this wasted steam that's going out. But it really is a beautiful day. We're having an awesome trip. The Brits are just having tremendous time, having lots of fun. And then it's a downpour. I mean, it's not just a light rain, it's a downpour. And we're going along, and so we're following in another car. And I said, Nick and Chris, you want to call it? And he said, call it. We're Brits. This is nothing. We can go in this. So we go for quite a ways, but still, we end up at 3:30 loading the whole thing up into the trailer. We've only gone about 20 miles. We're 30 miles short of what we were supposed to do on the first day because it rained. So the next day, we go out to Babbitt Ranches, and this is where we start. And we have to do the same thing. We have to warm the whole thing up, get the water boiling, create the steam, etc. And we get all that. But what happens is we have a fire. And there's a fire inside this compartment where the steam, where the gas is being fed to the fire to heat up the water and the steam. We put out the fire. Fortunately, there's no real damage. We're okay with that. Then along come some workers from Babbitt Ranches, some cowboys from the Babbitt Ranches, and Chris and Nick think it's pretty humorous that the cowboys are the Navajos are now the cowboys that are working on the ranches and that sort of thing. Anyway, so they thought that was kind of funny. And then they're off. They take off. Now, I'm going to show you, this is going to be a live clip. I want you to make sure you see the steam and also hear the steam going along. And we're probably going at about 15 or 20 miles an hour. And also, note this steering rod. It's just a steering rod like this. You know, it's not a wheel. It's just a steering rod. Because our next accident happens with the steering rod. Go ahead. But we're in a car right next to them and just following them along. And we're in a good part. This is part of the Babbitt Ranch Road. It's an excellent road, so we're having no problems. Lots of steam coming out. here, but we're on the flat, so we can go pretty fast. And then all of a sudden, this happens. This is the steering, the cotter pin that sits at the end of that rod. So if that cotter pin is not in there, that rod doesn't do anything, right? And you lose steering. So here's Chris explaining, I don't know whether you can hear him, he has a British accent, but he's explaining to you what happens. Go ahead, play the clip.
It's a pin, but we were driving along, and what happened? He pulls his pipe out, he starts to light his pipe, and the next minute, when it's like, whoa! And what's happening? You know, we just stopped, thank goodness. And I hopped out, and I looked down there, and I thought, hey, there's the pin sticking out. No steering.
And they're just having fun. I mean, you know, their gauge doesn't work, the steam doesn't work, the pin falls out, they have a flat tire. Just give them a spot of tea and they're fine. They're fine. So here we are on continuing on our adventure. We of course have another spot of tea because we have to have that every hour or so. And then here we are at Moki Stage Stop. If you're, I don't know how many of you are familiar with that. That is an actual stage stop back in the day. This is a cistern that used to catch water to feed the horses. So this was part of the stagecoach line that went up to Grandview Hotel back in the day and still exists today. And then of course on day 2, it's been raining, we have mud, we have water, we just can't move. So we hook up the horses, these horses here, and start towing the car for the last 17 miles, very similar to what happened back in 1902. And then we arrive 3 hours late to Grandview Tower, and we are really surprised that there's such a crowd that wants to see this car and welcome the car to Grandview. So here we are at Grandview Tower. All these people are here. Nick and Chris explain the tower, but they've been waiting for 3 hours for this car. They have no idea when the car is going to arrive. And then the house build up steam, and they actually motor the car into the last 5 miles from Grandview Tower to Grandview Point. And neither one of the Britt brothers had ever seen the Grand Canyon before, which was really cool, really cool. So here they are. If you remember the Al Doyle picture with Al sitting in the car, looking over the Grand Canyon, this is a wall that has since been built. This is not a very proud moment for me because I was so excited by all of this. It's now getting to be sunset. It's a beautiful day over the canyon. I actually instruct the house to go ahead and drive up the sidewalk because you can't get to here with an automobile. Drive up the sidewalk as I'm separating the tourists so that the car can get to the, it's not a good. And then we drive right up to this wall, but of course there's tourists from France that are sitting, traveled all this way to see the sunset at the Grand Canyon, and I asked them to move. It really was not and we took this photograph, and of course then they went back, but I mean, in hindsight, it was not a good thing.
It's really
it was not a good thing.
It's fine. The Brits hate the French.
What's
They're
that?
still fighting the 100-year war. It's all good. It's fun.
Well, I was all excited about this. I mean, we were getting the car up there. It was the same, blah, blah, blah. But anyway, so now they're seeing the Grand Canyon for the first time. They just have, they're just neat people and enjoying the Grand Canyon. And then this outstanding shot by Tom Martin of the two guys down below. It was awesome. It was a neat trip. Now I'd like to compare the two trips because you would think in 2014 we would know what we were doing and, you know, be much smarter. Well, we weren't. So the Lippenkalk in 1902, it had trailer bearing down on the hind axle. They packed no food or water. The automobile froze stiff. They had a water gauge burst, the sprocket chain broke, they had bad gas, they ran out of gas, and they had to be towed for the last 18 miles. And then you compare it to us, we did have problems with customs, the two brothers pulling the car across the pond. The steam valve sticks, they could not build up enough steam for inclines, so Chris had to push them up the inclines. We had a flat tire, pouring rain, fire. They lost the steering pin, and amazingly enough, we had to tow the car the last 17 miles to the Grange. So I'm going to explain to you just a little bit about what happened. And that's that the piston itself was smaller than the bore hole. So here's the steam coming down and pushing this piston, right? And that's what drove the car. But the piston was too small for the bore hole, so all the steam was just escaping past the piston, and it wasn't giving full power to that piston or the wheels. And that's what they had a problem. That's why they had a problem going up the incline. It turns out that they reworked the engine back in the UK, and they put it into a competition, and it went like 42 miles an hour for 120 miles or something like that. So they solved that problem. And this is Nick and Chris. And that's the presentation. This is Al Doyle up in 1902. And this is almost the same shot with Nick and Chris in the exact same automobile in 2014. So you have it.